In the brief time that airships were a popular means of air transport, they were involved in numerous incidents that shook the world. These incidents ranged from harmless and amusing to deadly tragedies that forever shook confidence in the validity of the vehicles. And all of them very interesting to study. Here are 5 airship disasters and mishaps from history. Number 5, the Los Angeles, 1927. The USS Los Angeles was a massive Zeppelin given to the United States by Germany as part of war reparations in 1924. She enjoyed a few years of normal service until her incident in New Jersey on the 25th of August 1927. After being refitted and undergoing repair, the Los Angeles was supposed to conduct an 8-hour flight at 10,000 feet in the air. The airship was docked on the high mast of the Naval Air Station in Lakehurst, New Jersey, preparing for its flight when a breeze blew in from the southeast at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Rather than spinning to face the wind, the breeze began to lift the tail of the airship high into the air. And it kept on rising by its tail, and the men on board were forced to grab hold of the ship's girders to avoid falling over. Suddenly, the ship was standing at a 90-degree angle over its mast. In the engine room at the back of the airship, now high in the air, one of the engineers reportedly shouted, "Holy I can see New York!" And nobody was quite sure what to do, and the commanders of the mast and the airship got into an argument about whether they should disconnect or not. Luckily, as quickly as things had gone wrong, they solved themselves. The ship did a complete flip of the high mast and lowered herself down onto the other side. She was quickly returned to her hangar to be inspected for damage, but nothing had been broken during the incident. The most damage to the airship had occurred inside the cars, where falling tools and objects had crashed into each other. The accident was quickly moved on from and nobody was hurt, and the crew at least left with a story to tell. And a century on from the incident, we can look back at the extraordinary photos of an airship hovering vertically in the air over its naval base and appreciate the pioneering efforts of early aviators who made flight what it is today. Number 4, USS Shenandoah, 1925. The USS Shenandoah was the United States' first attempt at natively constructing an airship that could patrol the seas and skies of the United States. At 680 feet long and with a crew of more than 40, when it was built in 1923, it was one of the largest airships in the United States. It was even the first airship to cross the Atlantic, as well as the first to conduct a transcontinental flight of America. She took part in naval exercises as a scout and was ordered to conduct Arctic exploration until a tear in her balloon prevented the mission from proceeding. It was a short career, but she was a popular vessel and became a symbol of the Navy, flying all over the country and drawing large crowds of spectators wherever she went. The US government took notice of this popularity, and the Shenandoah was sent on a tour of the United States in 1925. She was to visit 40 cities all across the American Midwest. On the 2nd of September, she set off on her journey, but it didn't take long for things to go tragically wrong on board. The next day, on the 3rd, a sudden storm hit the Shenandoah as she was traveling over Ohio. The storm lifted the Shenandoah and the change in pressure tore the balloon to pieces. The airship split into 3 and crashed to the ground outside the town of Caldwell. 14 of the crew were killed, either by falling out of the airship while it was being torn apart or when it hit the ground. Remarkably, the rear section of the airship remained aloft, and the 7 men inside managed to remain afloat for some time, despite it being detached from the rest of the airship. The story of the Shenandoah didn't end there, however. This was not merely a deadly crash, but the destruction of an icon of the United States. And actually then, the looting began almost immediately when the pieces of the ship made landfall. The Department of Justice and the Ohio National Guard tried to secure the site, and over the next few weeks, confiscated over 4 truckloads of materials that had been looted by locals from the wreckage. However, there was simply no way of finding it all. Even the logbook had been taken, depriving investigators of a valuable resource with which they could determine what had happened. Everything from the metal framework to the canvas of the balloon itself was an attractive item to try and grab. And one report even stated that a piece of canvas from the balloon was turned into a lampshade during the Great Depression. Once the looting had stopped, however, the wreck site itself became a tourist attraction, with thousands coming to view the crash, and a small local economy developed around it. Stalls were set up selling soda and water to the tourists flooding into the area. The cause of the crash was investigated jointly by the Army and the Navy, who found 2 reasons. First, the weather conditions around Ohio had been ignored in favour of pulling off a publicity stunt for the military. And 2, the helium inside the balloon was considered too valuable to allow any to waste, and so safety valves had been removed from the airship. This prevented pressure control during the rapid ascent, so safety requirements for airships were changed after this disaster, but airships would not remain in flight for much longer anyway. Number 3, the LZ-104, 1917. In 1917, the beleaguered troops of German East Africa were fighting a guerrilla war against the British, cut off from their supplies and running desperately low. A resupply mission by sea would be impossible, as the Royal Navy prevented any German ships from reaching so far away. A new plan would be needed, and the answer came in the form of the LZ-104 airship. Operation China's Snow, as it was called, was launched, in which the LZ-104 would fly from Bulgaria, across the Mediterranean, and over Egypt, making its way south until it could resupply the army. This was to be a one-way mission, and even the fabric that made up the airship's exterior skin was planned to be disassembled and turned into useful material for the army. On the 21st of November 1917, the airship set off from Yambol in Bulgaria, and for several days it sailed through the air, managing to travel through harsh weather and turbulence. Eventually, one of the 5 engines on board seized up, which reduced the airship's speed, and the electronics failed, rendering it unable to send signals, though it could still receive them. Then, over Khartoum, a signal was received from the West African Army, calling off the mission as they had lost control of their landing site. This signal may have actually been faked by the British, but records are unclear. Either way, the ship turned back from its mission and retreated back to Bulgaria. Though the mission was a failure, the LZ-104 managed to set a new record for airtime and distance travelled in an airship, having spent 95 hours in the air and travelled 4,200 miles in total. The celebration, however, was short-lived. The airship began operating out of Yambol, attacking targets across the Mediterranean in bombing raids. On the 7th of April 1918, she attempted to attack the British at Malta. An observing submarine commander reported seeing 2 bursts on board the airship before it was engulfed in a gigantic flame and it nosed down into the water. There were no survivors on board the 21-man crew. And strangely, neither the British nor Italians claimed the kill, and the destruction of the airship is likely the result of an accident on board rather than fire from enemy forces. Number 2, the C-8 blimp, 1919. The C-class were a type of blimp designed by the US Navy just after the First World War and were very, very simple in their design and function. Unlike a Zeppelin, the C-class did not have a rigid metal frame, but were more like a conventional balloon with a cab slung underneath. 10 of the blimps were completed, and they would go on to have tumultuous lives. On the 2nd of July 1919, the C-8 attempted to dock at Camp Holabird in Maryland. There were many spectators of the event watching the balloon come in, when suddenly something went badly wrong. The blimp somehow spontaneously ignited and loudly detonated above the ground. Fortunately, more than 80 adults and children on the ground were injured in the blast, and the 6-man crew on board the ship was lost. But a mile away from the explosion, windows and houses were totally blown out. This would not be the only disaster that the C-class of ships was involved in. Only 2 months earlier, the C-5 had been lost in a gale off the coast of Newfoundland, when it was blown out to sea while attempting a transatlantic crossing. The wind simply picked up the balloon while the ground crew were trying to handle it with ropes, and they lost their grip, and it just floated out to sea, never seen again. 2 years later, the C-3 would catch fire and crash while attempting to dock in Norfolk. Now, the US Navy eventually switched to non-flammable helium gas instead of hydrogen, but this limited the range of their airships, because helium weighs twice as much as hydrogen, and only allowed 93% of hydrogen's lifting capacity. And in the end, the ultimate cause of the C-8's destruction was never discovered, and will remain a mystery. Number 1, USS Akron, 1933. The USS Akron was the world's first flying aircraft carrier, operating with the United States Navy between 1931 and 1933. It was capable of carrying 4 aeroplanes that could be launched from its hold and then used to attack the enemy, before then being recovered through a trapeze mechanism. Though it never saw combat, it was a valuable experiment for the short time it was in service. On the 3rd of April 1933, just 2 years after it had been launched, the Akron cast off on a voyage along the coast of New England. This would be its last journey. The airship left dock at 7:30 in the evening with many distinguished guests on board, including a Rear Admiral, the commander of the Lakehurst Naval Station, and others. It was intended to be a display of the potential uses of the airship in naval service, but unfortunately, the day she left was also the beginning of a huge storm system that would sweep the American coast. Fog soon rolled in, and within a few hours, the ship had become difficult to control in the wind and rain they had flown directly into. Shortly after midnight, the Akron began a rapid descent into the ocean. The crew managed to eject ballast, which briefly stabilized the height, but it did not last long. The airship quickly began to sink again, this time hitting the ocean tail first. The waves quickly dragged the airship down, and the Akron was lost with almost all on board. Of the 76 men on board the vessel at the time of the crash, 73 died. This makes the Akron the single worst airship disaster in history. And to make matters worse, the rescue efforts also resulted in several dead. As a naval blimp was sent to help search for survivors in the water, the blimp found itself victim of the same stormy conditions, and it also sank, killing 2 of its crew. The reason for the deadliness behind the Akron disaster is that despite sailing over the ocean, there were no life jackets on board the vessel and only a single raft. The reports of survivors indicated that it was not the crash that resulted in the deaths, but drowning and the freezing temperatures of the Atlantic. After this, safety measures aboard airships were changed and all were equipped with life jackets. President Roosevelt gave a speech in the aftermath of the disaster in which he described the national disaster and praised the men lost in the crash as upholding to the end the finest traditions of the United States Navy. Now, the ultimate cause of the disaster is still unknown, but a lot of theories have been put forward about what caused that crazy descent. It's possible that it was simply a downdraft that caused the tail of the Akron to sink into the water, and the whole thing was subsequently pulled down. It's also possible that the altimeter on board was not properly calibrated for the low air pressure caused by the storm. Given the nearly 800-foot length of the airship and the difficulty in maneuvering such a large vehicle, if the captain thought he was at a higher altitude than he was, the airship's tail might have touched the water when the crew tried to pull up too quickly. The answer will likely never be known for sure. This is one of the many reasons why I don't ever travel in a hot air balloon. I'll stick to good old terra firma. It's October 1930, and looming high over the countryside is a flying giant. This is the Airship R101, the pride of British aerospace and the very latest thing in aviation technology. She's over 700 feet long and can soar over land and sea alike. The airship is about to make an historic voyage, flying from Britain to Karachi in Pakistan. But as it looms over onlookers just after takeoff, nobody aboard could know that this would be the R101's last flight, and things were about to go horribly wrong. The R101, aerial symbol of Britain's might. For those watching it during testing flights, it is a magnificent and majestic sight. The airship is longer than most ocean liners of the day and is painted in a dazzling silver colour. Well, where did the R101 come from? And what was its intended purpose? Most importantly of all, how did it all go so horribly wrong? The first truly successful airships appeared throughout Europe and America in the 1890s. Several attempts at airships had been made prior to the 20th century, with some examples in the mid-1800s even proving themselves a viable means of transport. However, they remained closer to novelties than useful vehicles. Those few that were built were difficult to control, low in capacity, and dangerous to pilot. Despite these teething troubles, they flew and mostly worked, however. Having had their concept proven, and with public successes fresh in people's minds, the world was set for an airship boom, and it was Germany that would find itself at the forefront of the new technology. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin was the leading figure in airship development, whose company was the first to use rigid airframes in their airships, providing a more stable structure. His new rigid airships, named Zeppelins after himself, became the gold standard, developing into a comfortable means of travel for the wealthy in an era before passenger planes. Before and during the First World War, airships were also utilised for military purposes by all the major nations of Europe. Zeppelins in particular became notorious for their long-distance bombing raids on Britain over the course of the First World War. Despite these raids being hugely ineffective and frankly a waste of resources Germany couldn't spare, the propaganda effect on the British was massive. Paranoia of German airships swept the country, and images of Germans bombing with impunity were shown around the world. At this point in the minds of the public, the airship was no longer merely a form of transport, but became an essential arm of the government. After the end of the war, Britain was faced with a very dramatically changed environment. The empire that had seemed so secure only a decade before was now coming apart at the seams from bankruptcy and independence movements. It was in this environment that the imperial airship scheme was conceived. To meet the challenges of a new age, a new technology would be utilised in order to bind the empire together and secure the power of Britain. Airships would fly across the world, removing the barriers of distance and permanently linking the empire and its people together. The idea of airships keeping the empire together seems almost quaint in the modern world, but it's a lot less so when you consider the primitive state of aeroplanes at the time. Despite their low capacity, airships allowed, at least theoretically, for comfortable and quick long-distance transport for important people and cargo. The end of the empire might seem obvious in hindsight, but at the time was an almost unthinkable calamity to the British government. The imperial airship scheme was first proposed at the 1921 Imperial Conference, but was not acted upon until after the 1923 election. It called for the construction of a fleet of airships that would bind the distant corners of the Empire together and was spearheaded by Lord Thompson. The decision was made to build 6 airships with 2 prototypes to be completed to kickstart the entire program. £1.3 million were allocated for the construction of 2 airships, though they would run over budget, and the R100 and R101 were expected to be designed and completed by the end of 1927. These airships were intended to conduct trial flights to Canada and India in preparation for regular Imperial connections. The R100 and the R101 were intended to encourage innovation in air travel, and in order to maximise the spread of funding and knowledge, construction would be split between the private and public sectors. The R100 was to be built by the private Vickers Limited Company, while the R101 was built at the Royal Airship Works in Cardington. With the greater leeway provided by having government backing, the R101 was considered a riskier design than the R100 because it implemented a number of design changes and technologies that had not been tested on airships before. For example, in the R101, 5 diesel engines were included for the first time on airships. This was due to concerns that the heat of India would cause petrol engines to ignite. And unfortunately, this new design required the engineers to join multiple engines together, which resulted in constant leakages, too much weight, and too little power. Poor connections between the engines also meant that they had a propensity to rattle themselves apart when operating for extended periods of time. In a final irony, the engines required petrol starters to function, which rendered their inclusion pointless to begin with. The engines themselves are, in a way, representative of the airship as a whole. A good and exciting idea on paper that was hastily thrown together for political purposes before underwhelming in every way upon completion. The rigid structure also used steel for the first time in an airship, which strengthened the structure but also increased the weight. Another attempted innovation was hollow metal reversible propeller blades intended to save on weight, but these were not successful and weren't implemented before the eventual first flight. When it came to luxury, the R101 was the most comfortable craft in the sky. Heaven help those unfortunates rattling and shaking away in small wicker chairs aboard Douglas DC-3s. R101's passengers could stretch their legs on long promenades, take meals in the dining room, and even smoke. Aboard the airship were 2 decks with a promenade walk on both, as well as sleeping quarters for more than 50 passengers, a dining room that could seat 60 people, and an asbestos-lined smoking room. It was a sparse, yet comfortable space, and the highlight of the whole thing was a spectacular viewing gallery with huge windows from which passengers could stare down at the world beneath their feet. The R101 and R100 were finally completed in 1929 and subjected to heavy publicity. Upon being completed, however, the ships were actually something of a disappointment to the British government. Despite the heavy publicity, and one of the trial flights actually being viewed by King George V and Queen Mary, the engineering community was also generally not impressed with the results of the program. One article in The Engineer, written in the September of 1929, complained that the ships cost more than £2 million, or around £147 million in today's money, to build, and were 2 years later than planned, were underpowered, overweight, and unable to carry enough passengers to make the vast expense worthwhile. The article concluded by calling the airships obsolete before they even left their sheds. Even the designs had been criticised before the ship had actually been built. E.F. Spanner, an appropriately named naval architect, had ominously predicted in 1927 that 40 men or more will probably lose their lives on or soon after the trial trip. Nevertheless, the public was enamoured with the R101 and what it promised to do for the United Kingdom. While it was on display outside its shed in Cardington, it continually attracted huge crowds wanting to catch a glimpse of the new vessel. Numerous trial flights were arranged that served little purpose beyond showing off the airships to the public and providing joyrides to selected officials. It was immediately apparent, however, that the R101 had some issues. It was tail-heavy, which made manoeuvring difficult. It also made flights to India impossible, as the changed conditions in a tropical environment meant that the loss of lift would be disastrous. Additionally, in early 1930, the inspector in charge of the Aeronautical Inspection Directorate at Cardington sent a letter to the Air Ministry in London advising that the R101 have its permit to fly revoked due to gas leakage and buoyancy issues. This letter was ignored and the permit to fly remained. The manager in charge of the construction of the airship was also the man responsible for advising the Secretary of State on the airship's safety. This conflict of interest meant that he would have been unlikely to raise any issues for fear of damaging his own career. Both ships lacked the 60 tons of lift required by the initial design request. The R101 was particularly heavy due to the new design features that had been included on the ship. The steel frame, large engines, and luxurious accommodations meant that the airship could only lift just over 30 tons of cargo. The outer covers on the lift balloons were also proving to be a concern. It lacked the strength to withstand inclement weather and quickly developed rips and tears along the entire length. Both airships had to be modified in order to meet the requirements of the initial design and safety, but even after the retrofits, the R101 was still well short of its required carrying capacity, being capable of only 40 tons of lift. In its final design, the R101 was 777 feet long and 131 feet in diameter. It was made up of frames joined together by girders. The frames divided the balloon into around 16 compartments, each of which contained a gas bag filled with hydrogen. The issues with the covering were never fully resolved, and it would be this oversight that likely caused the eventual crash of the airship. Test flights began in 1929 before the ship had been fully refitted. They continued in a haphazard manner until the final flight on the 4th of October, 1930. Despite this final flight, intending to travel all the way from Britain to India, there had been no real long-distance endurance testing, and the final certificate of airworthiness was only issued on the day of departure. The maiden voyage was set for October of 1930 in order to coincide with the Imperial Conference occurring that year in London. The airships were intended to be a symbol of the Empire after all, and confidence was increased by the successful flights of R100 from Britain to Canada that had taken place earlier in 1930. For the first leg of its first proper voyage, the R101 would carry 54 people on board, mainly comprised of the airship's backers and designers. Lord Thomson, who had conceived the Imperial airship scheme, was aboard along with members of the Air Ministry and R101's design team. As they boarded their airship, they must have felt a sense of elation as the vast silver bulk of the R101 towered over them. And very soon, though, their elation would turn to horror. It was Saturday, October 4th, 1930, time for the R101 to depart on what was destined to be its first and only voyage. Weather conditions across the route were being carefully monitored so as not to catch the crew of the R101 off guard, but almost immediately there arose a serious problem. The weather in the north of France was deteriorating and the R101 would be flying right through it. As it was operating on a political schedule rather than a practical one, the decision was made to press on and try to beat the weather. This was made in part due to the presence of Lord Thomson, who was eager to see the results of his program in action. The departure was arranged for 6:24 in the evening, with the passengers being hurried aboard and mist covering the landscape, and then she was off. The plan was that she would first travel to Bedford for a final visit to her hometown before carrying on to London, and then to Paris, Tours, Toulouse, Narbonne, and then across to Egypt. As the airship had never been fully loaded with fuel before, there was some surprise when 4 tons of ballast had to be dropped before she could gain height, but all was still going according to plan. The R101 was equipped with a water ballast system that would allow it to recover weight from rainwater. At 8:21 p.m, the R101 was flying over London and sent the message, "Over London, all well, moderate rain, base of low clouds, 1,500 feet, wind 240 degrees, 25 miles per hour. Course now set for Paris." From London to the French coast was another 3 hours of travel. By 11:36 p.m, the R101 sent a message confirming that they had reached France. From 11 till 2 in the morning, the crew changed watches, and a final message was received from the R101 at just after midnight, which ended with, "After an excellent supper, our distinguished passengers smoked a final cigar, having sighted the French coast. Have now gone to bed to rest after the excitement of their leave-taking. All essential services are functioning satisfactorily. Crew have settled down to the watch-keeping routine." This rather cheerful message informing Britain that all was going well, and the passengers, who were thoroughly enjoying themselves, offered no indication of what was soon to befall the ship. The last message ever sent by the airship was a navigational pulse sent out at 1:52 a.m, only minutes before the disaster. At 2 a.m, the watch changed for the final time. All seemed well aboard the airship. There was no concern about the weather, and it didn't seem exceptionally bumpy. Engineer Henry Leach was off duty in the smoking room between 1 and 2 a.m. when Captain Irwin entered the room and chatted with him and the chief engineer about the after engine. Leach then went to inspect the engine cars after the conversation and found them all to be in good working condition. It was then that problems began to arise, though. Eyewitnesses on the ground reported that at 2 a.m, the airship began to have trouble with the gusting winds above the French city of Beauvais. and that its promenade lights were obscured by cloud. This would make sense, as the airship was passing over the Beauvais Ridge, which had become well known among aviators for its dangerous winds. Suddenly, just after 2 a.m, disaster struck. The R101 entered a sudden and steep dive without warning. For more than 90 seconds, the ship descended at a terrifying 18-degree angle. The crew lost their footing and crashed to the deck, some hanging on for dear life. Furniture clattered across the floor as the airship dove. The crew in the control car tried to balance out the ship by pulling back on the elevator and lifting the nose. They managed, just, to raise the nose to 3 degrees above the horizon, but then they were faced with another issue. The elevator lever was now at its maximum, but the ship was only just reaching stability. Captain Irwin ordered all engines to either be slowed or brought to a stop to prevent any forward momentum. Wireless operator Arthur Disley passed the chief coxswain George Hunt in a corridor just after the engines had been stopped. The chief simply said, "We're down, lads," and the captain had most likely decided to attempt an emergency landing. R101 was now floating at just 550 feet or so, but the airship was over 770 feet long. For what must have seemed like an eternity, she hung there, but then the inevitable happened. Rigger Samuel Church had been ordered to release the emergency ballast in the nose to try to lighten it, but as he made his way forward, he felt the nose begin to drop beneath his feet. There was little hope of righting the airship before she hit the ground. The R101 slowly dropped at a fairly shallow angle downward before making contact with the sodden ground. The light snapped out across the airship, but she gently bounced along for 60 feet or so at 13 miles per hour and 22 kilometers per hour, a speed just above that of a perfect landing. The tail slowly dropped level, and as she leveled out, there was a crunch. Obviously, under some severe stresses, the airframe probably gave away somewhere inside, maybe even breaking the airship's back. The R101's nose came to rest in a wood. It must have seemed like it was all happening in slow motion. But then, all hell broke loose. The impact had twisted the ship's starboard engine car right around, and the hot engine was coming into contact with hydrogen gas released from one of the torn gas bags. In seconds, the loose hydrogen had ignited, and the R101 was engulfed in flames. The airship's fabric cover was incinerated in seconds, and the entire airship was reduced to a fireball, lighting up the French sky. Out of the 54 on board, there were only 6 survivors of the crash. 4 of them were engineers named Binks, Bell, Savory, and Cook. All 4 were in the engine cars outside the main hull and were able to escape through the windows of the car and away from the airship. Arthur Disley, who also survived, was a wireless operator who had been asleep in the crew quarters when the airship went down. He was awoken by the initial dive before Hunt had passed through the crew quarters and informed him of the crash. Disley got out of his bed and made his way to the electrical switchboard in order to cut the current, fearing that it may spark a fire if the airship crashed. Before he could cut the current, however, the airship went into its second dive and slammed into the ground. Disley described the impact as being so soft that it didn't even knock him to his feet. The fire started only a moment later, and Disley managed to survive by crawling out of the windows, and he was rescued by Leach, the last survivor. He was the foreman engineer on the staff at Cardington, and he had been sitting in the smoking room at the time of the crash. He was able to escape through the broken wooden walls of the smoking room and down the ship's outer cover to the safety of the ground. Along the way, he pulled Disley to safety despite suffering serious burns. For this act of heroism, he was personally awarded the Albert Medal by King George in the following year. Another man, the rigger George Church, survived for a short while, but succumbed to his injuries within a few days of the disaster. Without the testimony of the R101's captain and senior officers, the exact sequence of events is difficult to piece together in its entirety, but we are left with some valuable clues which can tell us what happened on that fateful night. As the R101 approached the Beauvais Ridge, gusting winds could have torn a hole in the fabric covering at the R101's nose. This would have exposed the delicate hydrogen-filled gas bags to the elements, and a tear would see gas quickly escape and the R-101's nose suddenly drop. The second dive could have been caused by another strong gust of wind and a failed or snapped control cable. Deprived of crucial lift, the magnificent R-101 became little more than a slowly deflating balloon. Impact was unavoidable, and the 5.5 million cubic feet, or 144 million litres of hydrogen gas, became a ticking time bomb. The inferno was total, and the whole airship was consumed in literal seconds, leaving behind a charred and twisted skeleton. Now, every death that day was a tragedy, but Lord Thomson, who was on board, his death was particularly notable. He had been a staunch supporter of the Imperial airship scheme from the beginning. His death marked the end of Britain's flirtation with airships and the beginning of British reliance on aeroplanes over lighter-than-air vehicles. Following the disaster of the R-101, even the successful sister ship, the R-100, was decommissioned and sold for scrap, along with the wreckage of R-101. The other planned airships in the scheme were also cancelled. The British airship dream died with R-101. Airships were large, slow, expensive, dangerous, and had a low carrying capacity. Airplanes were clearly the way of the future. They were cheaper, faster, easier to build, and less at the mercy of poor weather conditions. The Imperial airship scheme gave way to Imperial Airways, which operated a fleet of aircraft effectively in the role that airships had been intended to fill. Across the globe, nations that had experimented with zeppelins and airships began to suffer their own series of disasters and catastrophes, and pulled them from service and scrapped them. The Americans lost USS Shenandoah and Akron in short succession. The Italians lost the Italia, and it seemed like the days of the Zeppelin were finished. But it was the Germans who had been such eager proponents of airships that held on and continued to build them later into the 30s. They built the largest airships ever constructed, a pair of sister ships on a vast scale over 800 feet, or 249 meters in length. They were called Graf Zeppelin and Hindenburg. But that is a story for another day. In January 1913, the German airship L2 was commissioned by the Imperial German Navy as part of a 5-year airship expansion program greenlit by the Kaiser himself, who agreed to the construction of the airships on the condition that they were built with the secret capability to bomb England. Development of this craft was underway quickly, and by September of that same year, the L2 had begun her test flights in Friedrichshafen. And the hopes were high for the new vessel, because upon her acceptance into the German Navy, she was meant to be the flagship of the entire new German aerial fleet. This was a really exciting time. It was in the years before the First World War, and the technology was new and very impressive. All seemed to go according to plan, and testing proceeded as normal. That is, until one particularly sunny day in October. This was to be the day of the ship's altitude trial at Johannisthal Airfield, but things were getting off to a somewhat rocky start. Crowds had gathered to marvel at the new and impressive Zeppelin on the day of her trial, but once the airship was removed from its shed, it was clear that all was not well. One of L2's engines actually refused to start, requiring the test to be delayed while repairs got underway, and all told, the engines were in working order again in about 2 hours. However, this was enough time for a much larger and more deadly problem to arise. See, this was a very warm and sunny day, and the exposure to the warmth of the sun caused the hydrogen within the airship to heat up. This expanded the gas and increased the ship's buoyancy by a lot. Once released, the L2 rose quickly to an altitude of 2,000 feet or 610 meters in the air, and the crew needed to act quickly in order to slow their ascent. The solution was to vent hydrogen from the vessel through relief valves found along the bottom of the hull. However, much of this ship's design concept was still new and untested, and a flaw in this design was made abundantly clear when the vented hydrogen was sucked into an engine car, which was positioned far too close to the relief valve. The incredibly flammable hydrogen was brought into direct contact with the engine's near red-hot components, and there could be only one outcome. The onlookers who were gathered to watch from the ground could only look up in horror as flames began to spew from L2 and then a massive explosion was heard, the result of the detonation taking place within the engine car. As the crowd watched the airship fall from an altitude of 900 feet in a spectacle of flames and metal, a second explosion was heard, and then even more as the Zeppelin finally crashed to the ground. Explosions, one after another, ripped through the vessel as fire spread through the massive gas bags, each containing around 1 million cubic feet of flammable hydrogen gas. The flames burned out quickly, however, and onlookers rushed to the spot where L2 had crashed, eager to assist in the rescue of the crew and passengers on board. However, what they found when they arrived was merely twisted, smouldering scraps of metal, and only 3 apparent survivors, who had unfortunately all succumbed to their injuries soon after they were removed from the wreckage. The disaster had claimed the lives of all on board, including 7 officers, 2 personal friends of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and several high-ranking naval engineers. The Johannesthal air disaster occurred just 6 weeks after the tragic loss of the airship's predecessor, the German airship L1, which was itself brought down in the Red Sea due to a thunderstorm in what would later be known as the Heligoland air disaster. We'll talk about that one another day. These 2 accidents put together were responsible for the loss of many members of Germany's high-ranking airship crews. Ultimately, it put an end to the plans for the 5-year expansion of the country's airship force. Now, there are plenty of famous disasters in history that we can confidently say that nobody could have ever seen coming, be it due to bad luck, bad weather, or just bad timing. However, in the case of the R-38 airship, you really have to wonder how they didn't see it coming. The alarm bells were ringing loud and clear, but seemed to fall on deaf ears. It's a story with an unfortunate end so predictable, you'll wonder how they didn't see it a mile away. This is the story of the R-38. In June 1918, the British Admiralty ordered an airship fleet be built that could patrol the North Sea for 6 days with no support, as far as 300 miles, or about 480 kilometers from home base, up to an altitude of, say, 22,000 feet, or 6,700 meters. This impressive performance would keep the airship untouchable from most aircraft of the time. To this design specification, the R-38 class was to be the answer, a total of 4 airships designed to those Admiralty specifications to lead the British fleet. R-38 was the class leader, followed by R-39, 40 and 41. However, just as wartime brings a jarring end to peacetime routines, so too does the end of war spell abrupt changes to industries across the globe. The First World War finally came to an end in November of 1918, so the remainder of the 3 R-38 class ships were cancelled, and the original airship was nearly scrapped as well. However, the United States had been very impressed with the capabilities of the record-breaking R-34, which we'll touch on a little bit more later, and as such, they had expressed interest in the prospect of adding a new airship to their growing military power. A cash-strapped Britain opted to offer the still unfinished R-38 to America in October 1919, on the condition that Britain be able to modify the airship to allow for mooring and add ballast for counterbalance. Once construction was completed and the modifications were in place, it was decided that the ship would undergo a series of airworthiness trials before being handed over to America. Now, this is where the problems start. These trials were notoriously littered with recurring mechanical issues, especially pertaining to overbalance on control surfaces and numerous problems with girders failing. Now, each time one of these issues was supposedly repaired, another one would spring up again. Concerns began to spread among the engineers, experts, and even some top British and American military brass, believing the airship was in desperate need of further testing and design changes. However, those in charge of R-38's construction and trials on both the British and American sides would see the testing schedule rushed for various reasons. The British government, for example, was keen to dispose of the remnants of their now discarded airship fleet, and the Americans were eager to get their hands on their brand new toy after a year-long delay. Now, under normal circumstances, an airship would only be considered airworthy after about 150 hours of flight time. But due to pressure on both sides to hurry up and complete testing, an agreement was made that R-38 would be considered airworthy after just 50 hours. Now, obviously, this was much to the dismay of many experts who had hoped for a standard or even extended testing schedule, especially with so many issues arising in the trials that the airship had already completed. Air Commodore Edward Maitland, the chief of testing for R-38, was disgusted by this and protested. But incredibly, he was told by the Air Ministry not to provide advice unless asked. After a penultimate flight, despite numerous issues reported and much skepticism raised, it was decided that the airship's next trial would be her last before departing on a transatlantic delivery voyage for America. After a few weeks of bad weather delaying this final test, on August 23rd, 1921, R-38 was brought from her shed in Howden, destined for Fulham in Norfolk, where she would moor. But arriving on Fulham, low cloud was beginning to form on land, and the crew found that they couldn't see the ground or the airfield. They were forced to turn back and spend an unexpected night at sea. The next day, it was decided that instead of simply mooring at Fulham, where the cloud had not yet fully lifted, R-38 would return to Howden to land. The crew agreed that a few last-minute tests would be conducted on the return trip to Howden, such as a speed trial, but then a series of turning trials. This took place over the town of Hull. These turning trials were meant to simulate, ostensibly, rough weather, and they required rapid changes of the helm, or the steering, from hard over to hard over on both sides. Beneath the swiftly maneuvering airship, a crowd had formed in Hull, drawn by the sound of the engines. They must have been very excited to see an airship flying so low over their heads. Now, to this day, it's unknown why the order was issued, but the airship's rudders were being driven hard and fast, far beyond what would be required for the trial or even service. The rudder, which operationally should have only been set to a maximum of 15 degrees, was being driven rapidly from one side to the other at 25 degrees each time. Now, this quick waggling of the massive rudder put a huge amount of strain on the airframe, and this was an airframe which was already susceptible to weakness through failing girders. The crowd watched from below as a wrinkle began to form in the hull of the airship, and then, unbelievably, the massive craft simply cracked in half. Men and machinery rained out from either open end. It must have been a really awful sight to see them plummeting to Earth. But then it got exponentially worse because the hydrogen within the gas bags ignited and R-38 caught fire. It triggered a massive explosion that blew out glass windows throughout the town, could be heard up to 25 miles away. Only 5 people would survive the crash. Maitland, who had protested against R-38's rush trials, was himself a victim of the crash. After official inquiries were held, there were as many as 3, it was agreed that the R-38 disaster was primarily caused by the rough maneuvering of the turning trials that had caused too much stress on the hull. The inquiries also criticised the practice that the individuals responsible for the building of the airship were the same people responsible for determining the ship's worthiness. There was no apparent checks and balances in this arrangement, and almost no experts had been involved in making any major decisions surrounding the ship's testing schedule. 44 lives were claimed in the catastrophe that followed due to neglectful mismanagement and rushed trials. And on top of it all, you simply have to wonder how they didn't see it coming, knowing the multitude of structural failures they'd experienced during previous test flights. All in all, R-38's story is a masterclass in the consequences of silencing the experts and a grim reminder that no material object should ever be valued over the safety of human lives. For every disaster in which we know exactly what happened down to the tiniest detail, there will always be 1 or 2 more where we just could never hope to have all of the answers. The French airship Dixmude is one such story, a great disaster shrouded in mystery, in which all we can do is speculate on exactly what happened on that tragic day. The French airship Dixmude began its life as a German airship, designated L-72. Upon completion, L-72 was built with the intention to bomb New York City, but as we now know, this never came to pass. Instead, the First World War ended, and with it the construction of this potentially devastating airship was halted. She would sit incomplete for some time until ultimately it was decided that the airship would be handed over to the French as part of war reparations. Making her first test flight in July of 1920, she was officially christened Dixmude, so named in honour of fallen French soldiers in the Battle of Yser at the Belgian town of Dixmude in the First World War. Now, the French, however, were evidently not yet prepared for the airship's arrival. Photos taken of the airship near her shed clearly show that the shed was still under construction, even after France had obtained the vessel. But crucially, the hydrogen generating plant was reportedly not yet in service either. Dixmude would sit deflated for another 3 years until an attempt was finally made to reinflate her gas bags, and this attempt would reveal that the ship's gas bags had deteriorated so much while the ship was mothballed, they could no longer safely hold hydrogen. They'd need to be entirely replaced. Now, while replacement gas bags could have been sent for, Dixmude's commander, Lieutenant Jean Duplessis de Grenadon, convinced the French Navy to design and implement their own. Now, this process would wind up taking another 2 years, meaning that Dixmude spent the first 5 years of her life in various states of disrepair with only 4 flights under her belt. This long period of disuse would finally come to an end in August 1923, when the hydrogen bags were finally installed, and after a couple of short test flights, Dixmude was sent on a much longer 24-hour round trip. When this was completed satisfactorily, she was sent on lengthier flights of 50 and then over 118-hour-long journeys. It was clear that Dixmude was no slouch. She was capable of long-haul flights with the best of them. She was even paraded around on a publicity trip, where she was shown off to excited onlookers in cities like Toulouse, Bordeaux, and Lyon. They were all eager to see this powerful new French airship in action. However, despite the air of confidence surrounding the airship, the success was not to last. In December 1923, Dixmude took off on a planned long-duration flight bound for In Salah, an oasis located in the Sahara Desert. On the 4th day of her flight, the airship encountered some rather strong winds that were powerful enough to blow the airship back toward the African shore. The crew fought to keep their airship on course or simply ride out the storm, but fuel was running low, and there was only enough power for intermittent wireless communication. By all estimates, the Dixmude would only have enough fuel to last approximately 2 days. The crew fought bravely against strong winds, thunderstorms, and an airship with dwindling fuel supplies, while the commander searched desperately for a place to land. The final communication from Dixmude states that they were reeling in their radio antenna due to the turbulent weather. And 7 hours later, the Dixmude would be spotted falling from the sky by rail workers, whose attention had been caught by a sudden flash that lit up the night sky. Reports of the airship's demise, however, were initially dismissed by French officials who were not keen on admitting the loss of their grandiose new craft. Stories began to spread through the press of the airship having been spotted in different locations by eagle-eyed sky watchers, and hope remained high for the eventual arrival or recovery. However, on December 26th, 3 days after the final radio communication from Dixmude, the body of her commander, Duplessis, was recovered by a fisherman on the coast of Sicily. There could be no more denying it. The Dixmude had gone down, taking the lives of all 50 souls aboard her. Only small fragments were ever recovered. 2 small fuel tanks, some scraps of fabric, and then some lightweight fragments of aluminium girders that floated on the ocean's surface. 4 months later, another body was found, identified through papers as the radio man, Antoine Guillaume. But they were the only 2 members of Dixmude's complement ever found. It was never determined exactly what had caused the disaster, whether it was taken down due to the storm, ran out of fuel, or had some other mechanical failure. Regardless of the mystery surrounding the ship's demise, it's still considered one of the largest and most deadly airship disasters in history, and as a result, France abandoned all interest in building up their fleet of rigid airships. The loss of Dixmude and all her crew and passengers had ultimately been too high a price to pay. Finally, we turn to Tuesday, 15th of July, 1919. The Royal Air Force non-rigid airship, NS-11, is out on mine-hunting patrol duties over the North Sea. It's early morning, and the locals of the nearby village of Clay next the sea are drawn outside by the sounds of the low-flying airship engines off the coast. Suddenly, the sounds of the engine change, and they begin to sound laboured and troubled. Soon after, the crowd look on in horror as the once grand airship NS-11 falls from the sky in a mass of flames after being seen flying below a peculiar, greasy black cloud. The exact circumstances behind the airship's demise remain a mystery to this day. However, is it possible that this odd and sinister cloud formation seen by the residents was in some way responsible for the loss of NS-11 and all lives aboard? Well, to answer this, let's start from the very beginning. NS-11 started her life in 1918 as a member of the North Sea class of airships. This class of British non-rigid airships, or blimps, were the largest in the fleet. They were renowned for breaking flying records over their cousins, the rigid airships. the difference being that the rigid airships have an aluminium airframe over which the skin is stretched, whereas the blimps were simply large balloons. At the time, Britain wasn't a fan of the airships produced by their rigid airship program, so it was decided instead that a class of non-rigid airships would be ordered instead. They were planned to be more weatherworthy than traditional rigid airships, but still capable of long endurance flights. NS-11 was a prime example of this. Being the 11th iteration of the design, the development of these ships had come a long way since their inception. NS-11 was a record breaker, having set an endurance record in February of 1919 when she flew for 100 hours straight. Her captain, the proud and seasoned commander Warneford, was popular with his colleagues and was known to be an adept and efficient airman. He was undoubtedly proud of the record he'd set and the capabilities of his crew and his ship. NS-11 and her men were a force to be reckoned with, but there was one man willing to do just so. In July of 1919, with the crew of NS-11 present, Airship R-34, under command of George Herbert Scott, landed at Pulham Airship Station, having just set the new endurance record of 108 hours in the air. There was an air of celebration, of course. This was a triumph for all in aviation. However, it was only natural that Commander Warneford and the crew of NS-11 felt a bitter taste in their mouths while congratulating Commander Scott and his crew who had just claimed the record that Warneford and his men had worked so hard to attain. Now, while there wasn't really any actual bad blood between the two men, it's thought that this set of circumstances might have played a role in the events to come. Early in the morning of July 15th, 1919, NS-11 set off from Pulham on a routine mine hunting mission. At first, all seemed well with the ship. Wireless transmissions were being sent and received with no issue or apparent delay. The crew aboard reported no issues, and after the ship had been aloft for about 10 minutes, communications ceased. It was thought by the operators at Pulham Station there was simply nothing to report. Some 15 or 20 minutes later, NS-11 was seen to be moving quite slowly over the village of Clay next to the sea. Residents awakened by the clatter of the engines poked their heads out of their homes to marvel at the airship floating above. It was at this time that witnesses claimed to have seen a dark, quote, greasy cloud hovering above the airship. NS-11's engines then reportedly began sounding abnormal, as though there was some trouble with them. Witnesses then described the airship disappearing into the clouds, the loud clamour of the engines slowly fading away. And then, not long after, the airship was seen headed back toward the village when she suddenly and violently burst into flames in an explosion bright enough to light up the night sky. Flaming wreckage rained from the sky, and rescuers were immediately sent out in lifeboats to attempt to assist any survivors, although tragically, none were found. Pulham Station, for their part, remained blissfully unaware of the whole ordeal until they were contacted by the press, who were asking for a statement on the loss. This phone call threw the entire team into a frenzy as they scrambled to piece together the situation that was already being reported on by the press. Investigations were ordered into the cause of the accident, and the eyewitness reports of the sinister greasy black cloud were brought up, claiming that a rogue lightning strike may have been responsible for bringing down the airship. But this was dismissed, however, as it was discovered that the origin of the popular greasy black cloud claim was actually just from one witness, and it was uncorroborated. Others who saw the event claim the weather was actually clear that night and storms didn't roll in until after the disaster. Despite this, without fail, the infamous greasy black cloud is always mentioned in discussions on the demise of NS-11 to this day. The official findings of the investigation into the NS-11 disaster would ultimately and frustratingly be inconclusive. However, there might be more at work here. Remember that Commander Warneford was disappointed that his endurance record had just been taken from him right in front of his eyes. There's evidence pointing to Warneford bringing extra fuel and one fewer man on board than anticipated for the journey that morning. Many believe that Warneford was out to settle the score, and under the guise of a mine hunting mission was actually looking to reclaim the endurance record that he felt was rightfully owed. Having not got official clearance to attempt this feat, however, it would shine a bad light on the Royal Air Force if this fact became public knowledge. Rather than admit to Warneford going rogue and attempting missions without permission, the RAF reportedly swept the whole thing under the rug, calling the findings inconclusive and leaving more questions than answers at the end of the day. We may never know what Warneford's intentions truly were when he set off that morning at the helm of NS-11, but whether it be due to negligence, poor weather, or some other horrific, unforeseen circumstance, NS-11's endurance flying days would be tragically cut short just a few hours later. With so many accidents and incidents, it's no wonder that rigid airships didn't last long into the 20th century as a serious form of passenger transport or military craft. Join me again next time as we uncover still more tragic and mysterious airship disasters from history. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.